just got back from this year's Hacker Summer Camp. Hacker Summer Camp started way back in 1993 as one conference, DEF CON. And it took place more as a going-away party for a coworker than an actual full-blown conference. Then Black Hat came along about 5 years later. Then flash forward a decade or two, and you get B-Sides Las Vegas. And then you get the Diana Initiative. And now, Black Girls Hack is sponsoring SquadCon. And there are other vendor-specific ones as well, such as the one hosted by IO Active. Each of these mini security conferences run concurrent with each other, so you can run from one hotel to the other in the hot sun in one city. I, of course, use it as an opportunity to get some really great interviews. This episode's interview I actually recorded before Hacker Summer Camp 2024, and it's about a talk in the ICS village within DEF CON. What caught my eye was the researchers found a flaw in software used in both home and commercial solar panel systems, and it affects a large number of systems worldwide. Okay, for IoT, that's not too surprising. We often see some old protocols, such as MMQT, pushed to the limit, and therefore resulting in vulnerabilities across thousands, if not millions, of devices worldwide. The thing is, someone has to start the process of looking for these flaws. And as we will hear, the vendors also need to anticipate that their software will be vulnerable, and at the very least have a way for these researchers to report their findings. This is a story about researchers hacking into solar panels and how we've essentially learned nothing about IoT over the last decade, and why we really need to do more today to help shape tomorrow. I'm Robert Vamosi. This is Error Code.
So my name is Dan Berthet, and I am a Director of IoT Security for Bitdefender. Bitdefender is a global cybersecurity company that's been around for a quarter of a century, known for the consumer products, but now spanning into the enterprise and IoT spaces, and just one of those old guys that are still acting like a startup 25 years later.
So it turns out Dan is a huge fan of Error Code. In fact, he even made some suggestions as to how the conversation would go.
Let me see here. So I'm like, of course, the intros, and I was, if possible, I was going to browse with you a little bit on the decade that I've been working in IoT, working on some of the projects that actually kickstarted what we're doing currently, such as the briefly potentially browse about Bitdefender Box. Not like it's a defunct product now, not right now, but it spawned a whole technology platform. So that kind of enabled us to develop more and more technologies for IoT, and then do research and all this stuff. So it's basically how we grew into developing stuff for IoT as some of the first ones out there to actually be there when it happened, and shape the space, and then go through some of the research that we did, and some of the findings, why and how to define the IoT, because you can't secure something you can't define. Something about proliferation, diversity, and supply chain. Get into the Netgear report if we want. Issues that we found out of our research, and kind of share some of our upsets about the industry and what we really want to change if possible. If I had like a goldfish to get 3 wishes, I would use all to fix, and I'll tell you what, and going through the certification labeling initiatives if you want, and talking a little bit about the organizations that work on that. So this is my notes. I don't know if we want to go this route, but I can touch base on these happily.
I really appreciate that, Dan. And over the next 40 minutes or so, we did manage to touch upon most of these topics. What first drew my attention to Dan was that he and his team at Bitdefender found some CVEs associated with solar panels. And this research was presented in a talk called Beyond Sunset, exposing the occultations lurking in large-scale off-grid solar systems. If you've never been, DEF CON is the original hacker convention, and it's by far the largest in the world, and it's entirely volunteer-run. And now in its 32nd year, in addition to having several tracks of main programming, there are also about a dozen topic-specific villages, like lockpicking, automotive, or in this case, the IoT village where Dan presented.
Correct. So we'll be on the Villages stage on Saturday towards the end of the program. So it's a Village stage talk. I believe it's stage two, and we haven't really published much about it other than the high level blurb because we haven't really finalized disclosure on those findings. But I can give you the high level for sure.
As I said, I talked to Dan before he gave his talk, but the essentials are here, and I wanted him to tell us about what he found.
So normally we would look at the typical consumer IoT devices. We use a sort of a editorial approach to things in the sense that we look in our user base and look at what's hot out there and what piques our interest. Basically, the research team is fueled by curiosity, and that's how we choose our devices to look for when we look for vulnerabilities and do the research for them. But in this particular case, it was one of those, I won't say fortunate, it's kind of unfortunate, the situation, but it was a sort of an accident where the team ran into something that was interesting about their solar panel systems on their home.
So the researchers, they were just curious and started looking around on their own solar panel systems. And they found that they could get into the system pretty easily. That's not good.
So the high level here is the findings are it's about 3 CVEs, maybe 4. We have to kind of get to that in this week. And basically, it'll give us access to, it would give an attacker access to insane amounts of information about installed, and we're talking here residential providers. Like you and I would have stuff on our solar panels on our roofs and the whole system involved, and industrial, commercial entities as well. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of entities, and their data was at risk, at least during the research.
So right there, that's bad. You could get data about the homeowner, their usage, or perhaps even their account information with credit card information as well. But there's more.
Then you could potentially alter the grid, overload the grid, or take down the grid. And to give you the sense of the scale of this, we're talking about the installed capacity of about 3 medium countries, or total installed capacity for this system, these providers that are involved, that would surpass the U.S. solar generation capacity. So it's a really big system that was impacted. So without potentially getting into the names right now, it's top 5. It's a top 5 manufacturer globally, and the vulnerabilities would potentially allow attackers to exfiltrate enormous amounts of user data, location, whatever, or even shift the grid. And I know out of previous podcasts that there's been a lot of debate. Is the grid safe or not? How is it, potentially being impacted and stuff? And the grid is not something we focused previously that much because I said, we're focusing on, your baby monitors mostly, maybe, or TVs or whatever. But some of our teams already previously did research, for example, on EV charging stations as well, and we found vulnerabilities there as well. So I would say that based on the findings here, the grid now is no longer the old grid. So that would be whatever, coal power plant or gas power plant or distribution network and stuff. When we're talking about solar, they're much closer to what we are when we're talking about, connected cars, vehicle to vehicle, stuff like that. It's all connected. It's all online. All these things have apps. They have clouds. They talk to the web. They talk to the endpoints. And basically, I think it's up to the creativity of the potential attacker.
Dan's right. In a previous episode, I've talked with experts from BlackBerry and other companies about vulnerabilities in the power grid. But that power grid doesn't just include the utilities that we all know today. They include the electric vehicles that we drive, because that vehicle can act as a storage unit for electrical power. We have to start to think about the electrical grid more broadly, and thus the attacks will be much more creative in the future.
Because you have, I don't know if you have a solar system, but you have ways to limit the output based on the demand of the grid. So basically, if the grid is overloaded, you can set a limit and you're not going to pump more power into the grid. But let's say an attacker would bypass that and overload the grid, or all of a sudden remove power generation to I don't know. So which kind of anecdotally reminds me of some of my friends here in Silicon Valley who had a Tesla and a regular ICE car, and they were debating getting another EV, and they were like, well, what if the grid suffers? And what happens if, California gets into a situation where we can't drive either of our cars? And I never thought of it that way, but they brought it home where it's a potential nuisance, at least, to potentially worse kind of a situation.
So Dan's research looked at what if someone attacked the solar panels and in turn used that to affect the power grid in that area. While this might be isolated and rare, it is worth talking about today before someone gets a bright idea tomorrow.
We wouldn't fear monger. It's not about making people, scared about this, but the reality is with the kind of vulnerabilities that we were able to find and other people are able to find in other systems, it's very probable that, whoever's very motivated could do something. Um, there's obviously, and you've talked about this at large, with previous guests and so on. There's a bunch of potential attackers that are either driven by ideology or by ego or state actors and so on and so forth. So it really depends on of course, the motive of their potential attack on how this would unfold. But you only need somebody who has a little more time and has an ego to do something nefarious that just ruins people's days, just like where we have seen with, I don't know, people not being able to fly for the past 5 days or whatever other situation like that. So in a nutshell, that's what we're seeing. So we're seeing, an installed capacity larger than the size of the U.S. power generation over solar. In this particular case with this vendor, which is an enormous amount of risk out there in case these things would get potentially attacked. So
Okay, so that addressed some of the macro concerns that I have, like affecting the grid or the battery powered cars that are going to be contributing to the grid just as much as solar and wind. Dan mentioned consumer IoT, which is something I haven't really covered much on Error Code. I want to understand how an outside attack would work on a smart home, or how it would go after my smart TV, which I'm assuming is connected to my home network or my refrigerator or something else in the house. How would that work, given that the router is kind of a bottleneck?
it's not only the bottleneck, but increasingly it's one of those moats that um, ISPs through their CPs are making even more robust by adding cybersecurity, IoT specific layers of IoT cybersecurity on, which is something that we've also been part of by providing some of the original technologies that are available there.
One of the things Dan mentioned up front is that we need to define the Internet of Things. What is it? I talk about IoT all the time, but how do you define it? If we haven't been paying attention, there are devices around us that have been getting smarter and smarter. And as a result, we need to update them. In other words, we need to provide care and feeding. But who bothers to do that?
The issue here is not potentially the nuisance of somebody that lives in a smart home. And by all means, let's get this out of the way. I've, I do this experiment with my students. I teach a master's at a university, and we do an experiment with like how many connected devices do you think you have at home? And I just ask them out of the top of their head, and everybody gives me. And do this yourself if you want, or the listeners. I promise you have twice as many than you think you do if you were going to actually check. So the footprint is so much larger than we think, and in many cases, the routers either are not configured or not prepared to handle it.
Okay, that's interesting. The router that we use in our homes to connect to the internet isn't necessarily able to handle all the devices that we wish to connect to the internet.
So many ways that exposed devices, especially under IPv6, when they're directly exposed to the internet, um, so many devices can be taken over and taken advantage of and exploited further, which would eventually just bypass any potential local security. So, of course, yes, the first level defense, especially if the CPE, the router, has some sort of security on it, even a good configuration on a firewall is good enough. But some sort of intrusion detection system, some sort of DPS, whatever whatever um, DDoS protection layers. There's all these technologies are available. So of course, some of these things will prevent things. But at the same time, when you have potentially billions of devices in different settings, what we're looking at and what I personally look at when I look at the space is not you and I personally having again, a nuisance with the device being taken over. But I'm looking at the bigger picture, at the large scale of having millions, billions of computers just sitting out there on the network with increasingly more processing power that can be used for other purposes. And this is when I go ballistic and I'm all FUD, but it's a national security threat at this point, especially due to um, s- I don't want to say lack of regulation, but very thin regulation at this point. And of course, there's a lot of initiatives here that we can talk about in the following.
And if I were to want to target a MAC address of, say, an LG refrigerator in the home, I would be able to do so from the outside, right? Using what Dan just said, and then drill down to find that home had an LG and therefore a vulnerability that I already knew about.
We just recently published a report. I am almost positive you probably may have ran on it. It's been pretty loud, as you mentioned LG. We're just giving LG here as an example. Incidentally, it's a report we publish. We have nothing against LG; they're great. So are other manufacturers. In fact, we're here to make the industry better. We're friends with other vendors. We just want to make things better. We're not picking on anybody. So just to get out of the way. But yes, in this particular case, we published a report and we found multiple vulnerabilities um, on LG WebOS powered TVs in this case, or potentially other LG products as well, like you mentioned, like fridges and others might have been affected in other ways. And the issue here is that a lot of these attacks have to happen locally. That means access to the local network. So, of course, what that means is, and to your point, is that a lot of distributed attacks have to happen in a very specific set of circumstances where those devices are exposed. So, in our research on these LG TVs, we found about 90 to 110,000 LG TVs already exposed on Shodan and through those vulnerabilities. So they're already out there by the time we finalize the research. And a lot of these things you would see a lot of, you have a lot of information on, this data, this denial of service attack or this and that, and you wouldn't really know why that's about, what that's related to. But then, you do the findings, you get the findings and you're like, okay, now I kind of get why that was going on, why, this particular baby monitor was targeted and so on and so forth. So the fact that it's harder to attack some devices because of the levels in the network or the needing to have access locally or not all of them being able to directly be exposed, not all of them being directly exposed to the internet doesn't mean that the potential attacks are of lesser importance, especially if we're talking targeted attacks on high profile targets. And of course, we can always go back to the lists of, high profile journalists, that, activists, politicians, whatever. And that's bad enough, right? And then given enough time for an attacker and a bad actor, these things can be exposed in larger numbers, like you've seen with I mean, 100,000 devices on Shodan is a decent enough number of devices that can do a bunch of things. And once you get root on any of these devices, of course, you get access to the whole network. You get access to private information, location information, whatever have you. So again, it's very hard to pinpoint what's going on when these devices are breached. But kind of stepping back into, and this I think I care about, there hasn't been a standard decided, but based off available research, the average lifetime of an IoT device, a consumer IoT device, about 3 years. I can cite some sources. And during the life cycle of these products around the 3 years, it's not always that, us as researchers or other researchers in the field find the vulnerabilities on day one. They may be out there for a while, or who knows what, update breaks things or whatever. We might be in the later game of the cycle. So who knows who got access to those things and just, use them for very targeted attacks on potential important targets, or who knows what kind of other things. So for us, finding things later or sooner or later changes things for the better, but at the same time, there's a whole unknown of what exactly is going on with these devices during this life cycle. And it kind of gets to the bottom of our preoccupation of the slowness in which some vendors mitigate these issues, especially citing the short life cycle of these devices. Now, of course, and we're going to talk to other people maybe, and they're going to say, well, a lot of these platforms, a lot of these systems, and they're all grandfathered sometimes. So, what is this life cycle? Because if it's the same platform, it's just some new SoC or whatever, does that mean, that the new product is actually new? This new life cycle, is it another 3 years, or is it by now 4.5? Like, how do you decide that? But it's not particularly just that. I think it's easier to formulate it in a way that it makes sense. This particular product number is on the market from, I don't know, September 2018 until, January 2024, and that is its life. Has it received enough updates, software updates to improve their security during this life cycle? Are they currently supported after they've been sunset? What's the length of the vendor's support following the sunset of this product, and so on and so forth. So it's a lot of questions that would be so much easier to answer if there was a little more. Um, it's going to sound bad if I say a regulation potentially, but just a little more coordination. I feel in the industry. I feel like it's one of those spaces, and you said you've talked less about consumer IT. What I love about it and what I absolutely loathe about it is that it's such a greenfield. It's such a, gold rush. It's a bonanza, and anything goes compared to any other platform and system where everything is kind of put together. Everybody knows where to go for, compliance, for security, for advice, for whatever. There's just nothing here. It's just all for, anything goes really. You just want to put out a new product on the market, just start off, get some stuff off the shelf. You don't have to deal with anything, and if anything arises, you'll deal with it later. And that could be at the expense of individual users, groups of users, entire countries, or entire, global alliances. And there you go. You have a situation.
In the latest Netgear Bitdefender report, there's a line that says there's no shortage of vulnerable devices today. That's true. However, in the consumer world, it's really scary. I mean, if people in InfoSec and ICE-T can't figure out how these devices need to be updated on a regular basis, then how's the average consumer going to understand that? I've previously talked about how we're going to have a Patch Saturday, where you go around your home and you perform updates on your IoT devices. Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen.
Absolutely not. I strongly feel the average, not the average. I strongly feel that no consumer should ever deal with any of this stuff. At this point, we're far enough into technology, into the advancements in technology, that we absolutely have no reason to pass it on to the consumer. It's in fact why I believe ISPs have recently, and I mean recently because we're talking decades here, and they've been doing this for the last 5 years, have recently understood that not only is it better for them to expand their offering by adding cybersecurity and IoT cybersecurity into their platforms and services, but they also understood that they're expected to be the providers for these technologies. And we had some experience with this in the past. So at Bitdefender, I was Team Zero 2014 when we were looking at, having experience securing Windows platforms and Android and the Mac and so on for so many years at the time. We were looking into our homes and seeing there's all these new devices popping up. This is 2014, so it's a decade ago. As many things have progressed since, but it was, nascent. And we're looking around the house and I was like, okay, we got all these things that are popping up, but we have no way to secure them. And it seems like it's becoming a new reality, and there's just no way to stop this deluge of new devices. And they cannot support our classic endpoint security. There's no way to deploy anything on these things. So how do we tackle it? So it's how we came up with this idea that later became a product known as Bitdefender Box, which was one of the first consumer electronics devices that a software company built. It was all new for us. We had never built hardware before, but it wasn't for me as a Team Zero, it was a novelty enough. But for the world, it was a trial that we had to provide a security solution for all these things on the assumption that people were interested and were willing to um, fix these issues themselves or handle cybersecurity in their homes directly, because we know our customers, they were already buying other products. So we assumed and we knew that they were interested in doing this. But it's always hard to bring a new device into the home. It's always hard to get on top of an existing router or replacement and so on and so forth. But what we did with the product, and this is what I'm very proud of admin that being there, is we opened up the world to the realities of this needs to happen somewhere or another. We've previously, before building the product, had conversations with router manufacturers. We said, we believe this technology should sit on top of your routers. And they were not particularly interested or they did not really understand. Um, looking forward 10 years, we're now in a very successful partnership with Netgear, who are the leaders of consumer routers and networking in the world. It's no better router manufacturer out there to work with that are shipping every single one of their devices with this layer technology provided by Bitdefender on them, which is exactly where we wanted to get to. So now it's the router manufacturer that is providing these technologies, and further on partnerships that I cannot talk about too much. We're also providing this same technologies to ISPs around the world, and they automatically deploy these to the households because, again, consumers expect these to be handled by somebody else, and they shouldn't be bothered with them. And it's going to sound pretty bad, but it's hard for people like us in the industry to keep up sometimes with all the stuff that's going on, let alone expecting an average consumer who has to deal with other things and has different other experience background to have to deal with these as well.
So Dan and I, we've been around a while, more than 10 years in this space, and I wrote a book in 2011 about the dangers of IoT, or the potential dangers of IoT. It's really frustrating to me to see 10 years later that we still are having these discussions that seem pretty nascent in something that we've known for over a decade. What's Dan's take? What is the delay in jumping up and recognizing that this is a problem?
I'm going to say it's economics. It's always been. I feel the whole economy of IoT devices is driven by getting the best deal. That's for the consumer standpoint. And for the industry, it's as well as potentially profit. And this not to say that vendors are not interested in providing the best security out there, but until they're pressed hard by other realities, researchers, or regulation, it's unlikely anybody's going to do too much, especially since that's not a award that's often given. People, manufacturers get awards for, great experiences, a nice app, a good price, a nice ecosystem, all this and that. They don't really get an accolade for, oh, they've done an enormous amount of patches on time and they were fantastic updating. Nobody knows, what's behind the scenes. In fact, we as researchers trying to talk to these people where we found vulnerabilities with, we're having a hard time understanding how their engineering teams look like because we're trying to reach them to talk to them about the vulnerabilities we find. And it's a whole conversation that I'd like to dive into if you want it. But let me take a step back and just say that, and we wrote a paper on this. Having been around for so long, at some point we were, talking IoT, 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 and I was like, hold on, let's take a look around, see what we found. And I found, I think there was probably more out there, around 200 different definitions for IoT online. And that prompted us to think, how would we be able to secure something we can't define? So we try to give our definition of our own, but at the same time, in kind of building to the confusion and why all this is such a nebulous. Um, we as people in the industry talk about IoT, consumers don't. Consumers talk about smart home. And it's a dichotomy between the terms. So if you go in academia, if it's specialty journalism, if it's researchers, if it's, in the industry, we all talk about IoT, Internet of Things, and we know what that is. For consumers, just to prove the point and uh, make it clear, you're not going to go to a Best Buy and find an IoT section. Okay, you're going to find a smart home section. Every store has a smart home section because and that's, I parse the news based on terms. So if I see IoT in the title around, I know that's for me. But if I see smart home, I know that's for consumers. So it's very interesting. But I don't think that's by design. I think that was just accidentally, it happened that way. And I think it's great, but at the same time, I think it's a perilous situation because it prevents people from accessing relevant information, pertinent information. It doesn't necessarily always cross-pollinate, right? So whatever we talk about IoT doesn't always permeate to the consumer where they're looking for the smart home keywords. And if you want, I had done some research on this. There's like, checking out Google Trends and stuff, and it's so interesting to see how they, overlap and then they grow. And it just, around CS is a lot of smart home, and then you go to Black Hat and it's IoT or whatever. It's just like you'll see it. You'll see how we're gearing the conversation around these things. Um, so this was one of the first things that we had to deal in trying to define what we're doing, and then defining it makes it much easier to you can try to put a handle on what we're doing here, because of course then there's um XIoT. I'm sorry, I apologize to the company they coined it. I think it's a great thing to do, trying to coin a little bit something that you own later. Industrial IoT and so all the other forms, of course, which kind of um make the things even more murky. But we're talking um, as as consumer IoT, we're talking about platforms that include the hardware bit. We're including the application potentially if there's one, and the cloud that makes it all work, right? And then um, we are going to have to try to figure out how to make all these regulated in some way that they achieve a certain standard where they will be trustworthy and safe to use. So this is where the recent certification and labeling initiatives come into play.
In episode 30, I talked with Tom Pace of NetRise about IoT labeling for consumers. I'm interested in Dan's take on that, because my understanding is, at the end of the day, it's strictly voluntary with the device vendors.
It is, I believe, and we're talking about, and what you're talking about is the U.S. government National Institute of Standards initiative called the U.S. Cyber Trust Mark, which is a fantastic initiative, and there's a lot of really smart people involved in it. And we salute this initiative and all the others. I'm just going to kind of browse over a couple. So, for example, we have the CSA, the Consumer Security Association, that's involved in providing their own little platform. I believe their own certification. I believe it's called Verified Product Security. Sorry, Connectivity Standards Alliance. And my mind set up to something else. So Connectivity Standards, CSA, Connectivity Standards Alliance provides their own verified product security, and then we have the Internet Advisory Board of the NIST that has, alongside other people from the CTA and others, formulate this new, let's call it a standard, that is due this year, but it's more likely going to show up next year. That is going to provide what we see on the back of the cereal box, the same kind of any you buy a pack of pasta or snacks and you look in the back, there's a label that says how many calories. The US Cyber Trust Mark is going to provide the similar kind of information for that particular IoT. So you're going to buy, or let's say you're at Best Buy or whatever local store, you want to buy this baby monitor, and there's a QR code on the back with the logo. You can scan it. It'll take you to a page, and you'll see a list of actions and steps and requirements that manufacturer has gone through as required by the program to ensure some level of security. I just want to get us off real quick. So while the CSA verified program, and they're behind Matter and all this other standards, by the way, there's a bunch of really smart companies involved in there, all the big names. While they focus on validating, on verifying the hardware of the device, we got to take into account that there's, like we said earlier, more than the hardware of that particular device. We're talking about the cloud and the app as well. When we talk about IoT security, we have to account for all of them. So there's different layers of expectations. And I wager, and there's a conversation to be had of public perception when this is all said and done. It's in the market, and people have to make choices based off of this. Most of the times, we're going to go into a store or on Amazon and we're going to buy whatever's cheaper that has the best reviews and get done with it. How is the new label going to factor in?
So, as I said, the average consumer is not necessarily going to understand some of this stuff. So, having it on a label, I have a feeling it's going to take a while for it to really set in and start to be a market differentiator for the individual vendors.
And here's the caveat, and this is in no way to demean the initiative. It's in fact great that it's out there. I'm really excited it's out there, but it's does not guarantee that any of these devices have vulnerabilities or not. It just doesn't. It demands certain steps that would minimize the chance that the egregious vulnerabilities are going to be there. You know, is this, does it have secure boot? Is it, does it have a mechanism to update? Blah, blah, blah. All these, like, does it have military grade encryption? Just keywords. So again, these labeling programs are fantastic. You said they were volunteer, and that is correct. But I believe a lot of companies would love to be part of. And if you don't have it, you don't exist. It's going to be a badge of honor. Of course, the big companies are going to do it. But it's really interesting how this is going to work. So NIST is not going to govern this, or the FCC. They're just going to appoint a private company that's going to basically appoint other companies to be approved labs for certification. If, for example, LG, you mentioned previously, wants to be their own lab, they can. They'll be certified by that body, and they can approve their own devices. It's a pretty simple proposition.
Okay, there's a few problems I see with that. For example, if a vendor wants to be their own certifier, then basically they're self-attesting that this device is secure. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's secure, it just means that somebody at the company checked a bunch of boxes and said it was secure. It would be great if we had third party leaning in to understand what's going on in individual products, but that doesn't seem to be happening right now.
I want to believe that a lot of companies are going to join the program and they're going to have the label. And our contribution at Bitdefender for this, we hope, and we've talked to some of the work groups as well, and we hope they pick on this. They already thought about some of these things. And this kind of gets me into our most upsetting part of our research, which is in finding vulnerabilities or even patching them. We're trying to add on the label a mandatory requirement that there is a vulnerability disclosure link on the manufacturer's website that's certified with a form or an email address that's always monitored, potentially, ideally, with a PGP available. So researchers such as us and others can quickly and effectively contact the companies that are affected.
Years ago for Forbes, I talked with Katie Masuris, who founded the Bug Bounty program at Microsoft. And she has said that starting a bug bounty requires that the company have a way to ingest all the vulnerabilities that are being reported. Short of having a bug bounty, a lot of IoT vendors don't have any means by which a researcher can report a problem or a team that can follow up with a patch if necessary. They just don't have that maturity.
And this is the meat of the problem. During 10 years of doing research, vulnerability research on these consumer devices that we've done, the issue wasn't finding vulnerabilities. We're always going to find vulnerabilities. I'm not saying anything new. You and your guests have talked about this forever. There's always going to be vulnerabilities. Every update, every patch will screw something up, and then it's not an issue. Vulnerabilities are fine as long as we're mitigating them eventually. The issue, and this has been our experience, is that over 30% of the vendors we contact never reply and never patch their vulnerabilities. And our hardest, most enormous effort that we put into this part of research is reaching out and contacting vendors to tell them about the vulnerabilities that we found. And again, it's very time sensitive. Who knows where in the life cycle of that product we found this? Maybe it's been out there, the vulnerability has been out there for years. We need to fix this as quickly as possible. And then eventually they reply. And then eventually they realize it's not even them, but it's some component they got off the shelf, talk about supply chain issues. And then they needed to reach out to that vendor to patch that. And and then they're going to ask for 2 months, and then it's going to be 6 months extension. And here we go. We're 4 years into this product and they haven't patched it yet.
So perhaps we should include this ability to contact the company in any future regulations.
So if I could make a wish, find Aladdin or get that, golden fish, and I get three wishes. All of them are going to be dedicated to please put contact information for somebody who's in charge of security of these devices on your website and make it easy for researchers to find you because you have no idea how many times I've personally stalked people on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever to find the right person because one, you're in possession of highly sensitive information. You can't just go out to anybody and be like, "Hey, we found this thing." You don't know who's in charge of this. You don't know who can fix this, so on and so forth. It's been the hardest part of our 10 years of research in IoT security, reaching out to these people, being able to contact them, and getting some sort of resolve. And then, last but not least, um, how many times we reached, just regular support, and maybe that's offloaded to some other company, and how many times we got $10 gift cards for our dissatisfaction. And we're like, no, 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 this is not about it. We're okay with the product. Just get us through. And they're like, hey, here's $10 for your trouble. And we're like, you don't get it. So it's an uphill battle. I think we need to hire another team just to reach out to people. So yeah. So if going back to the initiatives and certifications, I would double down on what they're asking for. I would double down and I'd say, what if and I wrote, we wrote research on this, academic, and it's available publicly, where we suggest, based off of this research and the findings, we suggest, hey, let there be a mandatory time frame. So the news where the DoD has banned Hikvision, a Chinese company, from um, operating on the U.S. market because they're tied or linked to the Chinese government. I don't know the details, and they just ban them individually. Well, and that sounds a little targeted, and it's kind of unnerving sometimes. I don't know. Maybe I'm sure they had good reason, but the thing is, this could be codified in regulation that is encompassing. So basically, any vendor that doesn't patch within this time frame, doesn't offer this kind of information this time frame, blah blah blah, can be fined at first and can be kicked off a market later if they, for example, never patch or take too long to patch the vulnerabilities. And then you don't have to single out somebody for breaking some sort of rules, and it sounds like it's targeted. It's a general rule that affects everybody, and basically that's how you can protect the U.S. market, European market, Singaporean market, so on and so forth, by making rules based off of vendors' reaction time and handling of vulnerabilities.
That said, Bitdefender is creating its own verification program. So we talked about the TrustMark program, and before that, there was the Underwriters Lab seal of approval for IoT. Well, what's the difference about Bitdefender's program?
Well, for me, this was my most important pain point. That's why I talked for 10 minutes straight about it, and I apologize. I don't know how you can cut that in more so's and make it a little more interesting for the audience. We're definitely part of all these organizations, part of CSA. We're contributed to the CTA. We're, was always been there. We're part of the Tech Accord, what I'm sure you're familiar with. We're also building our own, let's say, vulnerability la verified labeling program based. Kind of give you an example. We look at maybe 100 devices a year to find vulnerabilities and or whatever, and not all these obviously have outstanding things that we find. So based off of a generic methodology, whichever device passes is going to get a verified sticker from us. And there's been debate. How this does this differentiate between the other initiatives? Well, like I said, CSA verified looks at the hardware of the device. NIST initiative, the Cyber Trust Mark looks at the ecosystem and how it's implemented, but we look at the actual device at a standpoint in time. So I think all these kind of converge into a little more trust for the consumer. So I'm very excited of the development. We're finally, after more than 10 years, in a space where it's becoming a little more regulated, a little more um, um, I feel like it's getting together. It's coming together. I feel like we're all getting to a space where the bonanza is getting, the Wild West is selling down. The gold rush is kind of clearing, and we're seeing more serious vendors or more serious regulation pushing vendors to be finally looking at security from the reality that it needs to be set in. Because again, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. We're talking about hundreds of millions of active devices, now very powerful computers just sitting out there on the network that can be used for whatever. And it begs the question, right? How much time can we leave? Just because we don't see sometimes the effects of attacks, we don't even know. I'm sure, I mean, we have some information. You've talked to the guests as well. We know these attacks are being carried out, but they're most of the times carried out in silence. And it's the most scary part that some of these attacks are not the very flamboyant, taking down the grid kind of things, but they're more, subtle and potentially more damaging because they attack other parts of the of of, uh, of our global alliances.
Oftentimes, ROI on security is invisible. You can't really see what's going on. You can't really say to the C suite, hey, we spent all this money, and look, we had no vulnerabilities, we had no problems with our products. So, this argument has come up throughout my career, going back to the days when I was at CNET, and that is, do you really need a Pearl Harbor moment? Do we need a moment when something tangible happens in the real world? I was in Auburn Hills, Michigan in 2015, shortly after the Jeep hack was announced at Black Hat that year. And it was being discussed openly for the first time among the OEMs and Tier 1s that were assembled in that room. That discussion, facilitated through SAE, gave us the new ISO 21434 standard that we have affecting automotive cybersecurity. So, is there something needed like a Jeep hack in the consumer space for IoT, where either the vendor feels it or the person at home realizes they can't live without their TV?
It's a great question. I think the kind of scale of events that are happening globally right now, I feel will leave the consumer pretty unfazed about potential large scale, and I'd still call them nuisances at the household level. But if anything, and if anything will happen, there's two potential avenues that might accelerate progress and security. That is obviously vendor implications, and there have been cases where I believe it was Amazon or somebody got sued for, and it's not just them. Multiple companies have gotten sued for vulnerabilities and the potential damages that ensued out of common consumer IoT devices. So that's definitely an impetus for a lot of vendors. It's money at stake. And secondly, I feel uh, I'm being around our peers. I'm not the majority when I yell national security. So I believe when we hear more of that, and I hope we hear more of that before it actually happens, that we actually get to act. And I just want to say that I'm very happy to be finally at a time when we're seeing some of these initiatives and some of these organizations getting together and pushing things at multiple levels to because I get it. It's hard. It's hard to pick the right supply provider, the supply chain provider, the platform. It's expensive. You're an expert in one particular field, but not the other. So you have to buy something off the shelf. You don't have control of what's in there. We've had multiple situations and research published on platforms that impacted hundreds of millions of devices across multiple vendors, and they were all impacted. And it's such a crazy scene to see how everybody, scrambles and struggles to get the stuff together and how every vendor, kind of fixes the thing and how they get priority or don't, or how they have different levels of partnership with the platform vendor and how some of them get priority or they get more support or the others don't. And it's such a fascinating, but also very scary setup. So, I strongly believe that the next few years are going to consolidate into a lot more needed and helpful regulation um, that will help us all be more secure because that's what we want.
I want to thank Dan for coming on the show and enlightening us on his journey through IoT over the last decade. It sounds like we are making progress, and it is important that we do the work that Dan is doing to identify vulnerabilities, to report them back to the vendors, and to start to see some sort of mitigations put in place. This is a problem that's getting worse, with millions of IoT devices out there in the field that are unprotected today, and more coming in the future. We really need to get on top of this, and I'm glad to see people like Dan are out there in the world. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. Join us on Discord. Search for Error Code Podcast to join the server, or go to errorcodepodcast.com to get more details. And tell me what you like, and even what you don't. I have more conversations coming up. I'll have conversations about Secure by Design and more about Operation Volt Typhoon. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.